So my name's Julius. I'm a director and head of design at Space Doctors, and we have been working on something which it's beyond just the EPIC conference itself. It's an ongoing research project that we've been engaged on, and it's where we turn some of our critical tools. We use semiotics, cultural insight, human insight, many different research methods. We've started to try and think the importance of that is to turn that in on ourselves as an industry, and to understand the way that the language that we use and the ideas that we put out in the world and the concepts and assumptions that we hold, what they set us up to do and what they hold us back from doing. So we call this New Words for New Worlds. And it's about, especially in relation to the EPIC conference, it's about creating a new language of resilience. So have any of you guys seen these words recently? Whether it be in a client or you've had to use it in a response to a client's brief. So right to win, stimulate desire, competitive advantage, white space, unmet needs, ownable benefit. There's something about this language. It implies within it this kind of highly competitive, like right to win, say, for example. It implies a kind of entitlement, as well as a kind of a bellicosity, a warlike nature, that there can't be like collaboration or participation. Somebody has to win, and the person that's going to win should always have won. So baked within our business language, there are some really problematic notions. And they're problematic for various reasons, but for us, this is the main one. So a regenerative future is a resilient thing. So a lot of our work, at its best, at what we want it to be, is aiming towards a regenerative future. And what we mean by that is beyond sustainable. Sustainability is no longer sustainable. A regenerative economy is one that replenishes or restores the environment from which it draws. And resilience, this idea of resilience at the core of a regenerative future, if we're going to build it, is this idea of making a resilient future, a resilient economy. And our language is holding us back. Baked into the language of business today are a set of assumptions, metaphors, meanings that will stop us from evolving to different forms of economy. It's a language that will eventually destroy us if we don't try and evolve it. And as people that work in the industry of research, of user experience, of how we communicate, we're uniquely positioned to influence and shape that. So we need some new words. And I think there's various ways that we can go about it. Just a quick thought as well, because greenwashing is something that's top of the list at the moment. Oh, I'm going to change the words, are you? That sounds really nice. Have you done anything? From the methods and the kind of research that we look at, particularly things like metaphoric theory or social, the social or cultural constructs of language and how they shape our behavior. And you guys as UX researchers will know that if you frame a navigational icon in one way, and iconography is a kind of language itself, people do one thing. And if you frame it in another way, they do another. So like, it's not just that what we do shapes our language shapes what we do. The metaphors we use to describe our values and our systems shape those systems. And there's some examples here. When we have a name for a complex, difficult thing that is difficult to see, like institutional racism, say, for example, it exists in many different places, in many different ways, quite hard to perceive as one thing. But when you have a name for it, when you can articulate it, you can do something about it. So the language helps us shape our world in new ways. So with that kind of effect, how do we need to shape the language of business to enable a regenerative future? This is some of that language at the beginning. I mean, let's look at it. Consumers. Is that all we do? Consume? Aren't we humans? Aren't we other sorts of things than purely a consumer or a user? Supply chain, value proposition, right to win, financial capital, unmet needs, white space, all of this. This is a language that is mechanistic, reductive, static. It takes various elements of business and places them in a context where they are scalable, replicable. We know why they're useful, but there are also damaging elements that come along with them. So we've been looking and done a great deal of research, and this involved natural language processing and analysis of a great deal of open source big data business texts, as well as analyzing RFPs from some of our clients, pulling out all the language, the gnarly little bits and pieces in there to try and understand how we might evolve it. And we think there's a better way. So there's another language that we can talk about the same thing, but we can shift it very subtly, and we can change how we understand those things. As opposed to consumers, maybe it's about humans, consumers of the planet. As opposed to supply chains, maybe it's value flows. As opposed to value proposition, maybe it's a value balance, because there are different kinds of value at stake whenever we construct an offer or a service or a product. So we think there's a way to evolve this language. And at the EPIC conference, we started to run a sort of an experiment, because we know that we can't do this alone. It's not just us that's going to shift the industry by coming up with like a snazzy set of business terms. It has to be a co-created collective effort to try and interrogate and evolve the language that we use when we consider how we do business. So that's our task, to create some new language that supports these principles of regeneration and resilience, so that as people of business, we can create a world that we're actually going to live in. There's no business to be done on a dead planet, So what does that look like? So we use something called a semiotic map. Semiotics is one of our core methodologies in the way that we pull apart meaning and signs and culture. And we came up with a semiotic map to describe 4 distinct worlds of this new resilient language that we can explore. And they were respectively restore, resurge, reimagine, and reconfigure. These are 4 different ways in which we can reconsider the way that resilience plays a role in the way that we do business. And there's language that goes with them. So first off, the language of restoration. This is a language of maintaining, repairing, stabilizing, supporting, replenishing. This is something that's resolute or durable. This is the kind of language you use when you're talking about benefits that are about restoration, right? So when a system, whether it's a business system or otherwise, is confronted by the need to change, it's tightly woven. It weathers the worst, it replaces the losses, it distributes strain, it maintains its boundaries. We found a useful metaphor here was about mangrove roots that go deep, and the way that they integrate with their environment to weather storms or difficult circumstances. And as our economy shift and the omni crisis that we seem to be in at the moment goes forward, we can understand why this kind of restoration, grounded, resilient nature might be useful in economy and business. Similarly, there's language in resurge, there's language in reimagine, and there's language in reconfiguration. And we've pulled apart and explored the vocabulary and the metaphors underneath those that we think are powerful. But the major exercise that the EPIC conference was engaged in, and this is an example of a kind of a virtual workspace, which I'll make sure to share the link with you guys later on. Where different people from different dimensions of business practice, of design, of research, can come and start contributing their language, the terms that they see as being useful to build out this new lexicon of regenerative business practice. And there were kind of 5 principles, I suppose, that we thought were really important. This is the call to action, because it is something that we want as many people as possible to participate in. 5 principles of resilience for approaching this task of reconfiguring the language that we use. The first is response diversity. So the most resilient systems are the most diverse. The monoculture, permaculture thought, like if you've only got one species of plant and one disease affects them, you've got no ecosystem left, it's all gone. Whereas actually the more diverse and complex the relationships are in the groups that you work in, business, cultural, organic or otherwise, the more able you are to survive changing circumstance and adversity. Micro to macro scale. So it's different parts of the system. The language that you use to talk about a particular business proposal might not be the same language you use to talk about your organizational structure. But that's the thing about resilient systems. The resilience goes all the way down through all the different layers. There's a word for it, which is really cool in systems theory called panarchy, if you're interested in how that works. Self-organization. So successful systems, there might be some top-down organizational force, but very often small groups will self-identify and organize themselves to create a local scale order. And I'm sure within organizations, particularly tech companies, there are examples of small groups that will take a task upon themselves, organize around it, and create new order, new structure, new innovation from their own energy, not instructed to do so. So in order to create new language, we need to self-organize. Radical imagination. It's difficult to push ourselves beyond the language that we use in our industry. There's a reason that we use it. It's because it gives us a shared diction to talk about priorities and business objectives. So it's a tricky task, and it requires us to use a kind of radical imagination. And finally, finding words that work. And this is the kind of the stickiness of the architect you talk about. Certain words stick, and they're not always going to be perfect or poetic or metaphoric. But you need to find the word that shifts your understanding to something that's more positive for people and the planet, that reframes the nature of value in your business, what success might look like, and make sure that it sticks. So that's leaning into the language that seems to get traction. Okay. And that's the big call to action at the end, right? Together, let's create some new words for new worlds. And that's it. But no, this is a redux. This is very redux. There's lots of there's lots of quite fascinating bits of detail and methodology underneath how we came to these conclusions, but we can chat about those. But yeah, are there any questions, any thoughts? How does this feel for you guys? Because we're all in different business departments, but I bet some of that language, the crunchy business language up front, felt familiar. Yeah, so any questions from anyone? Hello. Mm. That's so the question there, just to repeat it, because that's what I'm supposed to do, is how do you make sure that the language that you're recoding or changing has the internal traction it needs with your stakeholders while still pushing the envelope? Yeah, that is the essential tension at the heart of it. It's really hard. But I think there's some that are quite subtle and quite easy. Like if you're talking about your users or your consumers, there's something in that language that flattens them to one dimension of their behavior. Whereas I'm sure as user researchers, you've discovered that many of the dimensions that influence how users use are beyond the constraints of your measurement, right? Just like how they're feeling at a particular time of day, what relationships they have to what social groups. Like, so when we start shifting, as simple as stop talking about users, start talking about humans, we expand dimensions of their experience that mean that we're dealing with them in a richer, more comprehensive way. And your stakeholders will still know what you mean. You know, like it's still humans, but it's subtle and it has to start subtle. That's a simple challenge, but I get what you mean. There are some challenges at the more regenerative end of it, like actually we need to consider that we're not just trying to drive compulsive attention and efficiency, which is often is underneath some things in digital design, right? Tricky because that's your bottom line, but also let's think about how, like, what's the value of that attention? What are the values that we're generating? I think value is another useful one. There are loads of different kinds of value, and it's quite an easy one to unpack in a business discussion with senior stakeholders. They're like, yeah, we can drive value for you. Let's think about all the different kinds of value we can be driving. What's the social value? What's the systemic value? What's the natural value? What, not just what's the economic value? It just allows you to open the question. Does that answer your question? Cool. Anyone else? Thoughts? I saw that hand up first. Welcome to you next. Hello. It's a fascinating question. The point there, to repeat it, was that a lot of the world that we exist in now, this digital world, or the world of digital experience, is algorithmic. Our experience is defined and determined by non-human structures. And how do we use this concept of new words for new worlds to influence that question? And I think that it has to be a part of the values by which you do your algorithmic design, how you set your principles of design, or your risks, your barriers, your guardrails, as well as how you articulate, maybe even, because yes, we've got the human language, but if we really truly apply this, and I'm not a coder, well, not in a software development sense, we do semiotic codes, different thing. The way it is a language that you use to write an algorithm. If you understand that language deeply enough, I'm sure you can see where an exponential variable driven towards acquiring attention might be a damaging thing. And you could change the language so it's not exponential, but it's got certain rhythmic curves that allow people to get away, spend time, relax, restore themselves. So like, yes, algorithms are a language that increasingly define our digital experience, but also we can recode that language as well. It's just a principle and approach, I suppose. Does that answer your question? You're next. Loads. To repeat your question, so how does that work with us as a company, Space Doctors? How are we using it, and what challenges that we come across? Absolutely. Yeah. Loads of challenges, loads of problems. We work with some really large, quite problematic clients. And the reason why, yeah, no, it'd be nice to say it's all sexy and that we only work with cool little startups that make super bougie, like, and cradle to cradle, excellent, super green products. But actually the most good we can do, the most value we can drive is actually helping the process of transition, very large, economically dominant companies that might want to do good and might have a few key stakeholders with that intentionality. There's an entire organization of very baked in commercial culture that we need to work with, around, through, in order to make that change happen. So yes, we've had lots of political attentions. How do we use it? We might poke back at a brief in a quite cleverly constructed way, or we might reframe the value. We might make a very substantial case, evidence-based, for why a value proposition shouldn't just be about, or benefit. Let's talk about benefit. Product benefits are something you talk about all the time. What does this do for us? What makes it good? We might say, actually, it's not just about the benefit of the product. Who are the beneficiaries? Because we've seen with other brands that if you tell a story about the benefit all the way down your supply chain, how does it help the people that grow it? How does it restore the landscape the materials come from? How does it improve the social context when it's actually sold and embedded and passed on? What's its end of life? When we start talking in terms of expanding that, say that's all benefits you can talk about if you do them. It's on a client by client basis, and it's actually a constant task or effort, I think. I think if you embed this approach into the way that you work, you know that there's going to be friction, but you also try to work it through in the best way that you can with each. You have to meet people where they are. I think that's a big thing. We can't go in with this and just say, right, client, we're going to change all our language, it's going to be fine, because no, it's not going to work. You have to incrementally shift, adapt, evangelize, advocate, and shape your client relationships in a way where these values become apparent. Does that make sense? It's not an easy answer to that question. Any other questions? Hello. It does, but then clients are humans too. I mean, they really are. I mean, like, and so many of the clients we work with, I call them problematic. They're not problematic. They are systems of humans all working together to achieve what they think is the goal. But when you start talking about what actually the value, or what does success look like? How do we define success? Because in the West, for such a long time, success has been linked with linear upward notions of growth as this kind of forward, upwards, bigger, larger, better thought. But we know that in a planet with finite resources, that infinite growth and that measure of success can't really hold forever. So when you start saying, actually, what if success, and this is to the resilience thought, what if success looks like rhythmic cycles of growth? What if it's actually about shifting, like degrowth in some areas and growth in others? Much in the same way that we see in an ecosystem, these more organic or metaphors of economic success. You can start talking, and also people kind of know it. This is what I found with clients. They've got in their gut, a lot of clients feel that something's got to give, that the system they're working with isn't changing fast enough. And having a simple conversation can easily start to move that forward. Absolutely. Absolutely. Any other thoughts, questions, points of view? And how are we doing for time? Yeah. Hello. Mm-hmm. absolutely. So yes. So the question there, to repeat that, was how does affecting language move beyond greenwashing? What's the impact that it can have? And your premise or hypothesis was that you kind of want to understand a bit more about how affecting the symbolic changes the behavioral or the act. Right. So one of the theories that underpinned quite a lot of the research we did was a theory of embodied cognition. And it's by a group called Lakoff and Johnson. Super cool guys. One of my favorite books ever. If you ever have a chance to read it, do. It's called Metaphors We Live By. And the idea is that metaphor actually is part of our cognitive architecture. It's how we think. The metaphors we use genuinely change how we bodily perceive certain functions. So there's a reason that good is up. I'm feeling really up today, super light, and the down is bad, right? That why intimacy is warm and distance is cool. So like our body has to interpret quite abstract things using metaphors. And that does change the way we think about them. So actually, if you think about our notion of success, it's about growth. Like those two things are fundamentally rooted as kind of an orientational metaphor. It tells us that success is up and forward. And that's in some ways rooted to that notion of the graph line. If you can change that linear metaphor for success and start articulating how it might work in other ways, you will change how people measure their success. Similar things in more tangible ways. There are metaphors in terms of how we organize our own organizations, right? So like if we think about things in linear ways, linear systems, and a lot of our post-industrial economy is based on linear systems, we come thinking like human beings, think about human resources, right? Like everyone, this is a quite interesting example of that language. We think about people that are just a resource, an entity, a unit within a system that you can swap in and swap out and repair it if it's damaged. But suddenly in there, you've lost this whole dimension. And we all know that's the major critique of human resources when it goes bad, right? They apply a systemic practice to an empathetic function. And it feels a bit weird and cold and distant and strange. Talent management's not very much better, but but by talking to your humans in the right way, by changing the discourse, the framing by which you understand that, maybe it's just your human group that deal with the human problems, but they have them. I like the word human a lot. Kind of levels us all out. I think that when we change our language, it does change our world. It really does. And I think some of the fundamental examples at the front in that first slide, when we came up with the notion of white privilege or white centering, we could suddenly understand constructs of inequality and self-perception and cognition that we might not be able to understand before. When we come up with language, it reveals certain facets of our world, sometimes quite problematic facets, that we are hidden from our perception by the language that we use. Does that answer your question? No worries. How are we doing? We work with a huge network of partners, but change management is part of what we do. So we do cultural insight, well, culture with the big C, like a national culture or a subculture on a kind of a broad, quite large social framework. But every organization has a culture. It has a language. It has norms and assumptions baked into that language. How do you talk about power, about success, about promotion, about relations between people within that organization? Do all the different groups have the same words for the same things? Or do you actually have several cultures within one organization? Where are the friction points? So a lot of the techniques, we don't do it as often as we do other work, but we do have a really powerful set of tools when we approach it for internal discourse analysis, understanding the different discourses within a business and how you might evolve them to change the action of that business. But we will also work with, we've got a very large network. Space Doctors is a group. We've got our internal space doctors, but globally across 46 markets, I think, we've got a network of more, I'm not going to give you a number, but it's a large network of specific experts in particular skills that can work within any given market. So if you needed to understand someone that did change management in the US or in Korea or what have you, there's probably someone. And then sometimes, depending on the project, we'll work with external partners to facilitate that process. Because a lot of change management is about being with and within that group for an extended period of time in order to kind of help that transition, that shape stick, help get it sticky. It's very difficult to change anything from the outside. One of the reasons why I want us all to do this thing together, make some new world. I think that's it.
Yeah, thank you so much.